In this video, I'm going to do something different, something I haven't done before. Per viewer request, I'm going to respond to a video produced by another channel. Specifically, Religion for Breakfast video, Did the Gospels Copy Each Other? This is a video about the Synoptic Problem. I've linked Religion for Breakfast video in the video description, that's the first link. If you've watched that, and my own series on the Synoptic Problem, Who, When, and Why the Writing of the Gospels, you'll know we come to different conclusions about the Synoptic Problem. And I'd like to share some of the reasons why I come to different conclusions. I do have to say, though, I greatly appreciate the diligent and thoughtful scholarship that Religion for Breakfast and their team bring to the Synoptic Problem, and the attention they draw to this puzzle, which I, for one, find extraordinarily fascinating. This video is not intended as an attack, and I certainly hope it does not come across that way. I would be thrilled if it resulted in interest, dialogue, and an open mind with respect to the Synoptic Problem. Religion for Breakfast video could be described as a presentation of the consensus view, and my work as an argument against the consensus. I think there are points where the consensus is incorrect. The first major focus of Religion for Breakfast video is demonstrating the need for a literary or documentary solution to the Synoptic Problem. This is a point of agreement between us. We both agree that oral tradition alone is insufficient to explain the level of agreement among these documents. In the stories they tell, the sequence of the stories, the exact wording often used, and even agreement in fine points of Greek grammar, a language that has a lot of syntactic flexibility. This is not just multiple people remembering the same story. This is one author using another author as a source. I think Religion for Breakfast demonstrated this very effectively. They also helpfully point out that the Gospels have come down to us in Greek, and if Jesus spoke Aramaic, then this isn't just people recording the same stories in the same wording. This is people recording translations of the same stories in the same wording, which is all the more unlikely to be an accident, further evidence that there is a literary relationship among these documents. As a quick aside, Jesus did speak Aramaic, but for a look at the evidence that he did not only speak Aramaic, but also would have been conversant in Hebrew and Greek, take a look at my series, What Languages Did Jesus Speak? That's the third link in the video description. So the first major section is a point of agreement in our theories. However, I don't agree with one of the subsidiary conclusions that Religion for Breakfast draws. That is, that if we accept a literary solution to the Synoptic Problem, which they and I both do, that this therefore rules out traditional authorship of the Gospels, the belief that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written by men named Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This one does not follow. There are literary solutions to the Synoptic Problem that are consistent with traditional authorship, and there are literary solutions to the Synoptic Problem that are not consistent with traditional authorship, but they're not mutually exclusive categories. Sometimes it is argued that, well, you can't have both Matthew writing Matthew and Mark being dependent upon the testimony of Peter, which is a very common view. You can't have both. Actually, I think it's still possible you could. Why not? Well, the argument goes if Mark was first, that means Matthew has copied his own call as an apostle out of Mark. There's no way he would do that. I think there actually might be. If Matthew is as humble and self-effacing a guy as the rest of his gospel would lead us to believe, he does not want to draw a lot of attention to himself. And so it's not particularly difficult to imagine why he might say, okay, Mark included this story about me. I'll go ahead and put it in my gospel because people will expect me to. They know I'm writing this. But I'm not going to draw any more attention to myself than I have to. And in fact, Matthew writes a more concise version of this story than the more detailed version of the call of the tax collector that's found in Mark. But what if we flip it around? If Matthew's first, does that mean Mark could not have relied upon the testimony of Peter? No, I don't think so. Almost everybody who holds that Matthew was written early by the Apostle Matthew acknowledges that the other apostles had input into the compilation of this document. Matthew was the final author and editor, but the other apostles, including Peter, their leader, would have had a say in how these stories were told. And so it's not that Peter was relying on how Matthew told the story of Peter. Matthew was relying on how Peter told the story of Peter. So I think both are possible. Whether we accept Matthean or Markan priority, we haven't actually ruled out traditional authorship. A more detailed discussion of authorship is found in my series, Who, When, and Why, the Writing of the Gospels. So did the Gospels copy each other? Yes. Two of the Gospel writers used one or more other Gospels as sources in their writings. However, I don't think it would be appropriate to describe this with the verb to plagiarize. The rules and expectations we have around intellectual property today were not nearly so developed at that time, and we don't actually have any documentation at all from that time and place suggesting that this kind of borrowing would be considered in any way unethical. The next major focus in Religion for Breakfast video is on the case for Markan priority, the view that Mark was the first of the Gospels written. In my own work, I find that the evidence comes down in favor of Matthean priority, and I go through each of the major categories of arguments for Markan priority and show that they are each circular or reversible, or both. I would like to share my thoughts on the 3 arguments presented by Religion for Breakfast in favor of Markan Priority. I think these arguments are presented well. Those 3 arguments are Mark's redaction profile. Mark is the middle term between Matthew and Luke, and editorial fatigue. The first 2 are arguments from the implausibility of alternatives. That is, none of these other possibilities work, and this is the last one standing. Since it takes a little bit more time to respond to an argument from implausibility, you have to show a viable alternative. We'll take the direct argument, the argument from editorial fatigue first. In my own series on Markan Priority, I readily acknowledge I think editorial fatigue is the best of the arguments for Markan Priority. It's a good evidence-based argument. The trouble is, it's a good evidence-based argument for Markan Priority and for Matthean Priority. Religion for Breakfast rightly points out that there are examples where it looks like Matthew is fatigued in copying from Mark, but suggests there are no counterexamples. There are. In my own video on editorial fatigue, I outline 4 such examples, and I refer to the work of James Deardorff, who has compiled a more extensive list. This is the trouble with a lot of arguments in the Synoptic Problem, is they're reversible. We've got bidirectional evidence. This shows up in borrowed words. It looks like Matthew's borrowing words from Mark. It looks like Mark is borrowing words from Matthew. How are these documents influencing each other? This is a significant difficulty in synoptic studies. Most theories on the Synoptic Problem can explain the borrowing in one direction, but not both. In my own work, the Clementine Hebrew hypothesis does propose a viable means by which editorial fatigue took place in multiple directions. But I should acknowledge that one of the arguments brought up in the case for Markan Priority is that it's not just that we're looking for editorial fatigue, we're looking for edits that are characteristic of the author, the kinds of edits that we know Matthew and Luke like to make. I'm very cautious with this kind of argument because there's great risk of engaging in circular reasoning. Why? Because almost all efforts to determine the redaction profile of Matthew and Luke, to figure out what are the kinds of edits they like to make, presuppose Markan Priority. This is very helpful pedagogically because if we can positively identify one of their sources, we can read the source text and we can read their text, we can see directly how they edited their source. This is helpful methodologically if we're trying to make predictions about how Matthew and Luke might edit other sources, but it is not helpful in arguing for the priority of Mark, because the whole process had to assume Markan Priority at the outset. An argument that takes Markan Priority as a premise cannot be used to demonstrate Markan Priority as a conclusion. I also see editorial fatigue as a case where arguments for Markan Priority sometimes play both sides of the net. We're told that if Mark has the more consistent or more clear account, this is evidence that Mark was first because Matthew or Luke is fatigued in copying from Mark. But we're also told where Mark has the less clear or less consistent writing of the story, that this means that Mark was first because Matthew and Luke are cleaning up the oddities in Mark's writing. They're producing a more polished version. Which is it? Is Mark the more consistent or less consistent writer? Either way, it is the arguments for Markan Priority that are inconsistent. I suggest that some of the popular examples where it looks like Matthew or Luke are fatigued in copying from Mark could just as well be flipped around. And we could say, well, maybe Mark sees something that is unclear in his source, Matthew or Luke, and Mark, the master storyteller, is clarifying the story with additional details. So I do think editorial fatigue is a good evidence-based argument. The trouble is it's a reversible argument. It works for both Markan and Matthean Priority. The 4th link in the description is my deeper dive on editorial fatigue specifically. Next, let's turn to Mark's redaction profile. What are the types of edits that Mark would be making? This is an argument from implausibility, suggesting that if Mark has read Matthew and Luke, there's no way he would make these kinds of edits to his sources. These arguments frequently take the form of an argument from omission. That is, if Mark has read Matthew and or Luke, he's left a lot of material out. And many say, I can't think of any good reason why Mark would leave this out. I actually think there are some good reasons why Mark leaves out some of the content he does, and why he adds some of the things that he does. This will require looking at some stylistic differences between Matthew and Luke on the one hand, and Mark on the other. We have both internal and external evidence that Mark has gone through what I refer to in my own work as an oral filter. Mark is oral in a way that Matthew and Luke are not. As eminent a scholar as B.H. Streeter, with whom I actually do agree on this point, suggests that Mark looks like the shorthand notes of an extemporaneous sermon. If Matthew and Luke are the peer-reviewed literature of the time, Mark is the powerful preaching. Mark is writing the way you would traditionally speak a story, rather than the way you would traditionally write a story. It's well documented that when you write, your grammar tends to be better than when you speak live. When you write, you can go back and edit, you can take long pauses to think about what you want to say next. But when you speak live, sometimes things come out awkwardly. Sometimes you get long-winded or repetitive. These are some of the very features we see in Mark that some use to argue for Markan Priority. He included this odd story, or he's getting a little bit repetitive here, and so somebody cleaned it up later. Or it could just be that Mark is oral. Mark is based on what was being preached. These are exactly the features we would expect to find in extemporaneous speech. Furthermore, relative to the other Gospels, Mark focuses far and away more on what Jesus did than he does on what Jesus said. Matthew and John each devote a lot of space to long sermons. Luke less so. Mark, none. There are no long sermons in the Gospel of Mark. This is exactly what we would expect from an extemporaneous speech. When you're speaking live, it's easy to tell stories. This is who was here, they came, this is what happened. It's a lot harder to recite long monologues from memory, and this is exactly what Mark never does. For as much as Mark regularly refers to Jesus as a teacher, relative to the other Gospels, he doesn't preserve a lot of Jesus' teachings. Why then does Mark exclude the Sermon on the Mount? The same reason he excludes all of the other long sermons. Mark is based on preaching, largely given from memory. Now, if Mark is based on oral preaching, doesn't that mean Mark was first and Matthew and Luke came later? No, both possibilities are still in scope. Mark could be first, Mark could be last. We'll discuss that more on the topic of conflation at the end of this video, but all we need to acknowledge here is that it's possible for a speaker to work with written sources. Now, Religion for Breakfast doesn't actually focus on the Sermon on the Mount as an argument against Mark's redaction profile, probably because his co-writer is a proponent of the Farrer hypothesis, which does acknowledge it could be possible for a later writer to break apart the Sermon on the Mount. But he does draw attention to two specifics, things Mark has omitted if Mark is writing third, and that is the nativity account and the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Let's take each in turn. First, the nativity. Given everything we know about early Christians, is it possible that somebody familiar with the account could write about Jesus and leave that out? It's self-evident that the answer to that question is yes. 25 of the 27 books of the New Testament do not include any extended account of Jesus' nativity. And even if we restrict our focus to just the canonical Gospels, it won't do to say that a Gospel author couldn't possibly have left this out, because the author of the Gospel of John did not include a nativity account. And it's not particularly controversial to suggest that John was the last of the canonical Gospels to be written. If we extend our scope to all extant Christian writings from the 1st and 2nd centuries, we'll see that, yes, there was interest in the nativity, and they talked about it some, but the overwhelming majority of their writings don't talk about the nativity. They didn't feel the need to always repeat the story. Now, we live in a culture where the nativity account has achieved something of an iconic status. We have a major holiday where we celebrate it, we sing carols about it, we're used to hearing a recitation of it regularly. But it would be anachronistic to superimpose those views on a 1st century writer. Yes, they were interested in the nativity, but they didn't have the same cultural fascination with it that we do today. Unless we think it was obvious to a 1st century writer, this is how you're supposed to start a gospel account, let's keep in mind that not only did gospel as an independent genre of literature not exist yet, but none of the Gospels start with the nativity, and none of them start in the same way. Matthew starts with the genealogy, Mark with the baptism by John, or rather the preaching that came right before it, Luke with John the Baptist's backstory, and John with a creation motif. None of them start the same way. And so it's clear from the historical evidence that it was not apparent to a 1st century writer, this is how you're supposed to start a gospel. Finally, early Christian historians actually provide us with a pretty good explanation for why Mark might start his gospel the way he did. I mentioned earlier some external evidence about Mark going through an oral filter. I'm going to cover that here now as well. We have at least 2, possibly 3, early independent sources telling us that Mark's gospel is based upon the testimony or preaching of Peter. Now, whether we think that means it's directly based on what Peter said, or maybe a few steps removed, this is a community influenced by Peter's teachings, and this is the way the stories were told, I'm not going to take a position on that here. Authorship is a question for a deeper dive on in the Who, When, and Why series. But just the fact that we've got multiple early sources telling us Mark is based on preaching, that corroborates everything we found from the internal evidence, and it gives a good explanation for why a gospel might start with the baptism by John. When Peter tells the story about Jesus, where does he start? We have multiple New Testament accounts giving us the answer. When Peter tells the story of Jesus, he starts with the baptism by John. This is not surprising, especially if that's where Peter and or his brother Andrew joined the story. They weren't there for the nativity. For them, the story starts with John. And that's not just true of Peter and Andrew, but of thousands of people who knew John's preaching and went on to become believers in Christ. Multiple historical sources tell us that John's fame spread well beyond the Jordan. And so for numerous people, the story of the incredible ministry of this man from Galilee began with the foundation laid by John, a very sensible place for someone to start a story about Jesus. In fact, although only 2 of the 4 Gospels include the Nativity account, all 4 give prominent attention to Jesus' interaction with John the Baptist. This is a very viable and understandable place for an early Christian writer to start a story about Jesus. Next, let's turn to the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Here I must confess I think Religion for Breakfast has oversimplified what is admittedly a complex textual issue, the ending of the Gospel of Mark. I have a separate video on my channel going into detail on the ending of Mark and the evidences by which most have concluded that the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark are not part of the original. That is, Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20 don't look like part of the original, and I go through that and say, okay, if we grant that, which most scholars do, then what does that mean for the Synoptic Problem? What does that mean for early Christian beliefs? For a full look at that evidence, take a look at the other video. But I'd like to provide a Cliff Notes version here. The argument for Markan Priority suggests, okay, well that means that 16:8 is the original ending of Mark's Gospel. There's no post-resurrection appearances there. And they suggest the following premise. If Mark had known about post-resurrection appearances, he would have written about them. Or some premise very comparable to that. If we take that away, the argument doesn't work. We have to have a premise telling us that Mark wouldn't have left this out. Otherwise, there's no case to be made for Markan Priority, regardless of what position we take on the truncated ending of the Gospel of Mark. So this isn't my premise. This is the premise of people who disagree with me. But let's run with it. Premise 1, if Mark had known about post-resurrection appearances, he would have written about them. Let's then add to that a second premise that's not particularly controversial at all. Premise 2, Mark did know about post-resurrection appearances. In the other video, I demonstrate this 3 ways, and Religion for Breakfast did acknowledge in their video that Mark does actually foreshadow this even before we get to Mark chapter 16, verse 8. Well, from these 2 premises, the premise of people who are arguing for Markan Priority, and one other not particularly controversial detail, we actually have a logically valid deductive argument. From these 2 premises, it follows, therefore, Mark would have written about post-resurrection appearances. This undermines the very argument for Markan Priority, using the premise necessary to make a case for Markan Priority. Actually shows us Mark would have written about this, which itself is evidence that Mark chapter 16:8 is not the originally intended ending of Mark's Gospel. In the other video, I look at several lines of evidence suggesting that the original ending of Mark's Gospel may have been lost. If that's true, or even just likely, we can't make a textual argument at all. We can't compare the text of the ending of Mark with the endings of Matthew and Luke because we don't have the text. There are numerous solid pieces of evidence we can use to construct a theory on the Synoptic Problem. I don't think we need to resort to speculative assumptions about how Mark may or may not have intended to end his Gospel in order to solve the Synoptic Problem. A study of the Synoptic Problem may have implications for the ending of Mark, but trying to do it the other way is, I believe, backwards. It's like trying to put the foundation on top of the walls. And I propose that what we do and do not know about the ending of Mark's Gospel does not provide a sufficiently stable foundation to argue for or against the priority of Mark. Now, to be fair, Religion for Breakfast has provided a summary of a complex issue, and I don't mean to be critical of providing a summary. There are real-life constraints of time and space, and all content creators have to make editorial decisions and summarize things. And so I don't suggest that because Religion for Breakfast hasn't got into the details on this textual problem in Mark, that therefore they don't know about it. No, I suspect they probably do. But if I'm going to grant Religion for Breakfast the benefit of the doubt on that, and I think I should, then should we not also grant the same benefit of the doubt to the author of the Gospel of Mark? The fact that he did not write about something does not mean he didn't know about it. He too had to make editorial decisions and had to leave some things out. So I suggest that the oral nature of Mark actually does provide a really good explanation for many of the details Mark leaves out, as well as some of the odd details he adds, that there are good reasons why Mark would leave out the nativity, and that we do not have sufficient textual evidence to argue that Mark did not record anything about the post-resurrection appearances. Adopting the premise of people who disagree with me actually led deductively to a conclusion that undoes their own argument. Finally, the argument for Markan Priority from Mark as the middle term between Matthew and Luke. This is a compound argument. First, Religion for Breakfast makes the case that Mark is the middle term, and then shows why that is only plausible if Mark wrote first. I actually agree with the first part of the argument. Mark is the middle term between Matthew and Luke. This is very apparent in looking at a synopsis of the three Gospels next to each other. In the triple tradition, Mark is more similar to Matthew, and Mark is more similar to Luke than Matthew and Luke are to each other. Religion for Breakfast suggests, though, that this is only consistent with Mark writing first. However, as ably demonstrated by B.C. Butler in the 1950s, Mark as the middle term, by itself, is logically consistent with any possible chronological arrangement of the first three Gospels. It could be that Mark is the middle term because Mark wrote first and Matthew and Luke drew from Mark. It could be that Mark is the middle term because Mark wrote second. He drew from Matthew. And then Luke drew from both Matthew and Mark, but had a strong preference for the wording and order of Mark. Or it could be that Mark is the middle term because Mark wrote third and blended the material from Matthew and Luke. And although I'm not an Augustinian, I think there are other problems with the Augustinian hypothesis, which holds that Mark was second. I do have to acknowledge that Augustinians, like B.C. Butler, like John Wenham, have very effectively shown how Mark as the middle term can be consistent with their own view. So I wouldn't rule out all other possibilities except Mark first, based on Mark being the middle term. I do think there is a case to be made for Mark being third. But I will also readily acknowledge Religion for Breakfast hit the nail right on the head in pointing out one of the principal problems with the two gospel hypothesis, which holds that Mark was third, and that is the problem of microconflation. Macroconflation, borrowing the order of a few stories from Matthew, then taking a chunk out of Luke, then a few stories from Matthew, then a few stories from Luke. This is not problematic. That's a straightforward editorial procedure. We see that in a number of ancient writings. What is problematic is microconflation, stitching together a few words from this scroll and a few words from that scroll. I agree with Religion for Breakfast. This is a problem, but I also must point out that microconflation is not a problem only for the two gospel hypothesis. It is a problem for all three of the most popular synoptic hypotheses today. The two gospel hypothesis has the most microconflation to account for, but it's not a problem of kind, it's a problem of quantity. Each of the hypotheses needs to be able to acknowledge a mechanism by which microconflation could occur, and I suggest, generally speaking, they are unable to do so. Let's take a look at each. The two-source hypothesis. Proponents of this hypothesis have long had to acknowledge overlap between Mark and Q. I actually think extensive overlap between Mark and Q was a mistake. It has actually led to the erosion of some of the very reasons to believe Q existed in the first place. But it was a necessary defensive maneuver to protect the two-source hypothesis from a valid criticism. The trouble is this. If Mark and Q overlap, then Matthew and Luke are microconflating the texts of Mark and Q repeatedly. How about the Ferrer hypothesis? On this hypothesis, Luke has microconflated the texts of Mark and Matthew, his sources. In the triple tradition, that is material that's found in all three Gospels, there are numerous minor agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark. Now, Religion for Breakfast suggested that Matthew and Luke seldom agree with each other unless they also agree with Mark. I think what he meant to say there is they seldom agree in order against Mark, that's true, but they agree in minor details against Mark all the time. These are called the minor agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark. There are literally hundreds of examples. In every single pericope in the triple tradition, there are minor agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark, which means that Luke has combined wording from Mark and wording from Matthew. He has conflated at the micro level, at the level of words and phrases. Luke has engaged in microconflation in every single story in the triple tradition. So yes, microconflation is a real problem, but it is a problem for all of the major hypotheses on the synoptic problem. In my own theory, the Clementine Hebrew hypothesis, I propose a mechanism by which microconflation could occur. Once we acknowledge microconflation could occur a dozen times, Well, then could it have happened 2 dozen times? Once we acknowledge it could have happened 2 dozen times, could it have happened 4 dozen times? The key is, what is that mechanism? I propose that Mark writing third and going through an oral filter actually provides that mechanism. I agree with Religion for Breakfast that somebody is not going through a deliberate, sustained effort to stitch together words from this scroll and that scroll. In working with scrolls, they didn't have big writing desks like we do today. There's no way for a person to work with 3 scrolls at the same time. A scroll is an unwieldy instrument. It takes 2 hands to manipulate. If you're working with 3 scrolls, you'd either have to lay them all out on the ground and crawl back and forth between them, or just work from your sources from memory. I've read them a whole bunch of times. I know what they say. I'm going to quote from memory. Or you'd have to have a team of people. One person's got this scroll, one person's got that scroll, and so on. But in any of those cases, at no point is the person writing on the scroll of Mark actually simultaneously looking at the scroll of Matthew or Luke. The material has to go through human memory. Human memory is the explanation for microconflation. Whether it's short-term memory, just read it, just heard it, or it's long-term memory, I've read these stories a bunch of times, I don't need to go back and reference them. There's no escaping human memory in a world in which writing is taking place on scrolls. I suggest the way Mark microconflated Matthew and Luke is because whether the speaker or the writer or both, very intimately familiar with the stories told by Matthew and Luke, microconflated them, blended them in their head. This is something you can actually test. Pick a story for which there are at least 2 written versions. Read them a dozen times each. This will be easier if you pick a short story. Then set them aside and record yourself reciting the story. If you do not deliberately favor one version over the other, you will, without even intending to do so, microconflate the stories in your head. It becomes very difficult to remember, well, did this one have this phrase or did that one? You tell the story drawing from both sources. And that's what Mark is, a series of dozens of stories. He tells this story, he's familiar with 2 versions of the story, he presents a version that is a blend of both of them. He goes to the next story, same thing, and so on. We actually see this showing up in later writings. There's a great example in Polycarp chapter 2, where he does with Matthew and Luke exactly what I'm suggesting that Mark has done with Matthew and Luke. Polycarp, quoting from memory, microconflates the stories. We see it in Clement. We see it in other Christian writers. People working with the Gospels doing what I've suggested that Mark has done with his 2 Gospel sources. I believe microconflation in human memory is the viable explanation. It is a mechanism by which an otherwise absurd procedure could actually happen. And it works if Mark is third, blending the stories told by Matthew and Luke in his head. A more full description of microconflation on my theory would also involve a discussion of how the Gospel of Matthew was translated from Hebrew into Greek. That's a separate video on my channel. That's the last link in the video description. Putting the 2 together, how Matthew was translated from Hebrew into Greek, and microconflation, by putting Mark through an oral filter, blending the stories of Matthew and Luke, it offers a viable mechanism by which microconflation can occur, something which I respectfully suggest is almost always lacking in a discussion of the synoptic problem. All the theories have to deal with microconflation, but how is it that this happened? So I do agree that Mark is the middle term between Matthew and Luke. I also suggest that the best explanation for microconflation actually has Mark third. Now, in conclusion, it would certainly be possible for someone to object to my thoughts by saying, yeah, but these ideas just aren't particularly popular in New Testament studies today. And that's true, they're not, for at least 2 reasons. Number 1, this particular combination of ideas is new and not terribly well known. And 2, this is a major departure from the status quo. Academia tends to be more amenable to changes by degrees, incremental changes, rather than a big change all at once. And of course, I can understand why people would not like counter-arguments coming from a guy like me who runs an anonymous YouTube channel. But there are some advantages to that. I don't have to deal with the political pressures of academia, where there is real pressure towards conformity. If you don't agree with enough of what your colleagues say, they stop citing your work. You have to be able to get people to cite your work, or you do not make it in a publish or perish environment. And so you can't afford to challenge the consensus too significantly on too many topics all at once. But that's what I'm doing here. If what I'm suggesting is true, that Mark was not first, Matthew was. And Matthew wasn't originally written in Greek, but in Hebrew. Those are 2 major changes versus the status quo. But it wouldn't work to try to work on one of them, get it across the finish line, then work on the other one. you'd be left with a half-baked interim theory that would be very vulnerable. So yes, I am suggesting a significant adjustment is needed in synoptic studies, and I can appreciate why some people don't like hearing that message. Totally understand it. I don't, however, subscribe to the idea that if two people fundamentally disagree on the solution to the synoptic problem, that it means that one of them just doesn't know what they're talking about or isn't familiar with the data. No, reasonable people have disagreed on the synoptic problem for centuries. It is a challenging problem. It's why some people refer to it as the intractable problem. I do think, though, that there is something to be said for presuppositions. What premises do we bring to the table? All of us have biases. All of us have a worldview. Two very common premises that I've paid attention to are one on the conservative side, many assume biblical inerrancy, and one on the liberal side, many assume the implausibility of the supernatural. These are very common presuppositions in New Testament scholarship. Some people assume them directly, others not directly, but they rely upon the work of those who have, and so it sneaks in the back door. I do not use either of these presuppositions in my work on the New Testament. I don't think it would be right for a historian to make such a significant assumption at the outset before even looking at the evidence. And so yes, by not using two of the most common assumptions in New Testament studies, I do come to different conclusions. And while acknowledging that my theory is not particularly popular, I don't stake my theory on its popularity, but on its adherence to textual and historical evidence. If you found this video helpful and would like to see more content like this, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and share this video with someone else who might be interested.